now have in the world only one socioeconomic system, and that socioeconomic system is capitalism. Capitalism should not be seen as some idealized system where everything works fine. It can never work like that.
Professor Branko Milanovic is a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality at the City University of New York. He was a lead economist at the World Bank's Research Department for almost 20 years and a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington from 2003 to 2005. Branko's work focuses on income inequality. He's written various books now on this topic. 2016 book, Global Inequality, a new approach for the age of globalization, addressed economic and political issues of globalization. 3 years later, another book, Capitalism Alone, The Future of the System That Rules the World, was an Economist Best Book of the Year, a Financial Times Best Book of the Year, a Foreign Affairs Best Book of the Year, and talked about the capitalism's rise to global dominance. And the most recent book, called Visions of Inequality, from the French Revolution to the End of the Cold War, which is also an FT Best Book of the Year.
Capitalism is currently the only game in town, but it comes in different flavors. China is indeed, in the economic sense, a capitalist country. It's a capitalist country because between 70 and 80% of the value added is produced in the private enterprises. However, China is not exactly like the United States because the state has a much greater importance, including controlling what Lenin called the heights of the system.
Draw out a landscape for us on how the world is doing on inequality. What are the major trends across various dimensions?
Global inequality is on the decline. These countries that used to be poor are China, India, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and so forth. And they have moved up in the income distribution. And they have lots of people. And thereby, global inequality has been reduced significantly by 10 Gini points in the last 25 years.
What about China? Is levels of inequality in China trending downwards or upwards?
China may be slowing its rate of growth, which I think is not unexpected.
What's your sense on India? What prospects do you see for India?
India is obviously a giant, and India now would come to play geopolitically more and more important role. Because India is the only very important country, plus a nuclear power, which is not in anybody's camp. It has democratic system. It has strong role of the state.
What's your view on how tech has been shaping inequality, both within countries and between countries? And then also from a future standpoint, how do you expect technology to shape inequality patterns in the world?
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Of course, it's a pleasure to be on your show. I mean, particularly because you have also quite well-known people with very strong opinions, whether it be about China, globalization, the new economic order, if you will, or inequality. So I'm actually very happy to contribute to this very interesting podcast and the discussion.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to it. And that's really the goal for us, to try and connect different thoughts, different schools of thought, different thinkers, big picture thinkers like yourself, and cross-pollinate a lot of these ideas that, exist around the world and see how they might apply, to different parts of the world, really from a global perspective, and not just focus on, let's say, the perspective of the US or just China, but really look at the rest of the world as well. So before we get started, Branko, I thought I'll ask you to spend a couple of minutes on telling us about your journey, right? Where you started, where you've been, and where you are now.
It's kind of hard to do it in 2 or 3 minutes. So let me try to be brief and to sort of highlight the main steps, actually, or the main decisions that I made. I did my dissertation in 1987 in Yugoslavia, and I want to point this out because the topic was economic inequality in Yugoslavia, which is very similar to what I continued doing then over the years. It was really using household surveys, calculating inequality, sort of looking at whether there was relationship between the inequality and the increase in productivity, and the differences between inequality between different social classes. The classes existed, I mean,
Yeah.
not in the Marxist sense, but there was a division of the population in the data into rural, urban, so-called mixed households and pensioner households. Then I applied and I got a job in the World Bank in the 1980s. The war in Yugoslavia started in 1991, so that actually made for sure that I will not go back during the war. So I spent it in the US, I
Yeah.
spent it in the World Bank. And then I worked for about more than 10, well, maybe 10 years or so. Maybe 15 years in the World Bank Research Department, which was an ideal place for me because it was the research unit in the research department that did the work with household surveys all around the world. So that basically continued my dissertation, work that I did in the dissertation, but now on a much broader scale. For many people, that's the unit that has become famous by producing that $1 per day poverty line that now it's $2.15, but the same idea still exists, is to measure absolute poverty. And it is in that unit that I had the idea, I think it was 99, that my first paper was 1999, when I said, like, why don't we do global inequality? That did not really meet with a huge sort of, acclaim or interest because people were saying, oh, you remember Jagdish Bhagwati saying this makes no sense. Why do you put a rich person from Nigeria next to a poor person in, Zambia? What do they have in common and so on? Anyway, so to cut the long story short, this is what I continued working. It led to the production of this quite famous elephant graph that many people have heard, which then, of course, had implications for globalization, for who won, who lost, the relationship between China and the United States. And then, of course, that led me to Capitalism Alone, which actually is dominated by the relationship between the US and China. And that was not an accidental thing because at the same time that I was very much interested in numbers, I was always very much interested in social issues. As a kid, I was actually a quite assiduous reader of Marx. And consequently, then, to some extent, all of that came together in that interest both for society and capitalist development and why socialism failed, and numerical part, which really had to deal with inequality. So that's more or less the story. I hope it makes sense. Every story of life, towards the end of their life, it starts making sense because it seems inevitable. But everybody who lives that life knows that nothing is inevitable. That life could have really taken very many different turns, and we would also tell it as almost an inevitable life.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think there's a quote. I want to say it's by Steve Jobs. It might be someone else, but the quote basically says, "Very hard to connect the dots looking forward, but a little bit easier to connect the dots looking backward."
I love biographies, but I'm actually also skeptical of them because every biographer, by definition, has to tell a story. So the events which
Yeah,
happen, as I said, provide a story, and there is a certain amount of almost inevitability that it should develop only like that. But as I said, we do know that actually the dots, when they are being formed, can lead you in very different directions, and there is, that's also the issue of inequality. That's what John Romer calls the difference between what he calls episodic luck and circumstances. Episodic luck means that you get a job because it just happens at that point that somebody else has left. So this is not something that you could forecast. And that might make a huge difference
yeah.
in your life that you were just simply lucky.
That's right. That's right. So I want to dive deeper into, before we get into visions of inequality, I want to dive deeper into Capitalism Alone. Right? As you mentioned, that book was focused on
Yeah.
the US and China. I think many people talk about various aspects of the last 30, 40 years as far as the US and China and their relationship is concerned. Obviously, people talk about the rise of China and the alleviation of poverty there, integration of China into the global trading system. From the US context, people talk mostly, when they talk about China, they talk about the loss of jobs that has meant for mostly for middle America, right? And of course, today, a few years after your book has come out, like 7, 8 years ago now, but the conversation today is so much more, um, um, so much more complicated, right? So political today. It dominates the presidential debates, policy debates in the Congress in the U.S., and of course, even China now is dealing with inequality as a problem within itself as well now, right? Where mostly the talk has always been about convergence, between Asia and Western part of the world. Now there's talk of even within China inequality. All of that to say, I want to ask you, from that book, Capitalism Alone, looking back now a few years, um, tell us what were some of the key learnings or key insights that you would like to share as far as the different models of capitalism that you've also seen emerge. You've spoken about liberal capitalism and political capitalism. And where do you think the different nations that are today dealing with inequality, how are they maybe tweaking the form of capitalism that they adopt for their own country? Starting with obviously the US and China, but also maybe other parts of the world, Europe, India, and other places.
Yeah, well, okay, let me just say, I think actually first, Capitalism Alone is probably in terms of readership and well, maybe not the most successful book. Maybe the Global Inequality was more successful in terms of readership. But Capitalism Alone combined the two things to which I already alluded. This is the social part and the empirical part, which dealt with inequality. Now, let me go for the social or political part. My argument there was first to say that we now have in the world only one socioeconomic system, and that socioeconomic system is capitalism. I follow there very closely definitions of Max Weber and Karl Marx, which is very powerful and very simple. The definition says is that capitalism is really basically defined when majority of production is conducted on privately owned means of production, where most of labor is hired labor. Most, I'm always saying most. You never have a system where this is 100%. And that
Yeah.
decentralization, the coordination between different units is decentralized. So there is no plan, there is no sort of a general scheme of how things would move. Now, if you look at that, and that was my second point, China is indeed in the sort of economic sense a capitalist country. It's a capitalist country because about between 70 and 80% of the value added is produced in the private enterprises. More than 80% of labor force is working either on their own land, as they are like in the countryside, or they are working with their own or other people's, not government, tools of production, which is capital, in the urban areas. So really the employment, the state employment is under 20%. State-owned enterprise employment plus government administration plus party and so on. And obviously the decentralization is, the system is decentralized. However, China is not exactly like the United States. And it's not like the United States because the state has a much greater importance, including controlling what Lenin called, economic, the heights of the system in the sense of the banking system, banking and finance, electricity consumption, iron production, even, now we have seen new tech firms. So the state has some important presence, plus it has an implicit power which is greater than the implicit power in the United States, for example, to decide to annul in the last moment the IPO that Jack Ma was planning several years ago, which actually really required a very strong state to do that in 24 hours. So that's why it is a political capitalism and not liberal capitalism of the United States, but it's still capitalist. And my final point, I'll be very brief on that, was in chapter 3, which deals with China. To derive the political capitalism nature of China from the original socialist revolutions there, in the sense that the socialist revolutions played a role in China and Vietnam, and then I have a list of about a dozen of other countries, which was very similar to the role that a commercial bourgeoisies played in the West. It sounds at first counterintuitive, but when you think more about that, what communist revolutions did, they actually got rid of all the impediments to development of capitalism in China by breaking the power of the feudal or quasi-feudal classes, improving education, bringing women into the labor force, uh, nationalizing and then privatizing land, destroying landlords and their power, which reside very often in usury. So they really destroyed these impediments to growth. And then they planned to make socialism, but that didn't work. And actually, what they did was create political capitalism. So that I think is an important message in the book, and that's why the title of the book is Capitalism, Alone. Now, alone means there is no other competitor, but alone means, and we will talk about that for sure, that you have a monopoly. And once you have a monopoly on globally, you actually display some of very bad features of capitalism, which were concealed or not really emphasized when capitalism had to struggle for domination with socialism. So that's what alone means in the title of the book.
Yeah, yeah. We recently had Ruchir Sharma also on the podcast, who's written a book called What Went Wrong with Capitalism. He's writing from the US standpoint, and he says that both the amount of government spending that's today going on, the levels of deficit that the US government today sits on, the kind of handouts it's been giving during the COVID years, but even before and after, has meant that the government has become massive and it's massively leveraged, and that's not sustainable. And that's one thing he says is wrong with capitalism in the US. Second thing he says is that really big firms are trying to dominate a lot more, and as a result of which, combined with easy finance driven by government policies, is preventing creative destruction, right? Which he holds as a key pillar of capitalism as he conceptualizes it, right? This idea of competition and creative destruction, so that capital gets allocated more efficiently to the most efficient firms. Um, so I want to ask you, is your sense that capitalism in the US is working well?
First of all, as I was saying before, capitalism is currently the only game in town. Uh, but it comes in different flavors. And actually, as I mentioned before, it's not only China and Vietnam. You can actually, that there are very strong elements of political capitalism in countries uh, Ethiopia, for example, Laos, Burma. You can even speak of political capitalism in Russia or even in Hungary, even in Turkey. So, there are different versions of the strong state, which is a capitalist state. And that's what I mean. Now, the US state,
Yeah.
of course, has increased in some respects because of COVID. But, that was one off event with very large transfers, which, by the way, you see in income distribution data. And if you want to make people angry, you tell them that the largest decline in the US inequality in the last 50 years took place under the last year of Trump presidency. So they hit the roof, but it's a fact because the Congress, not Trump, but Congress passed really the huge, about 15% GDP acts, several acts which supported small businesses, individuals with low incomes, people who lost jobs, and so on. So that was really unprecedented in the scope and CARES Act, in the scope and size. So that's what happened. Now, how is capitalism working? I would, let me put it this way. I would not say with Sharma what's wrong with capitalism. Capitalism should not be seen as some idealized system where everything works fine. It never worked like that. It was actually, if you go back to Adam Smith, it was the system essentially of, when he describes it, where the acquisition of wealth was done through plunder, monopoly, monopsony, colonization, cheating. I mean, he's incredibly critical of course, East India Company, of all trading companies, Venice, Genoa, Pisa. So that's how capitalism was created. We know that, of course, slavery played an enormous role, serfdom and so on. But it was still capitalism. But if we imagine that capitalism is some kind of society a la Valras, that first all endowments are somehow really legally obtained always through exchange, which doesn't have power relationship there, and then you sell and buy things again on markets that are perfect, and there is no political or other power. Well, simply that capitalism never existed, nor will it exist. So I think then we should not use that imagined capitalism. We might use it as a sort of indication, but not really something that against which we have to judge the current capitalism. Now, let me just move one small thing about creative destruction. People talk a lot about creative destruction. Indeed, it is in Schumpeter. But talking now about visions of inequality, the first definition was Marx. It was in Marx, and Schumpeter actually acknowledges it, says it actually comes from Marx. But more importantly, Schumpeter argues very strongly. If you have a creative destruction, you have set companies that are the best in innovating these things, and you have monopolies. So he actually sees capitalism as monopolistic capitalism by its very nature, and that's what we see today. If Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and others have de facto taken large chunks of their respective markets, that's precisely what Schumpeter was expecting, because they did creative destruction, they introduced new technology, and they created monopolies. So for Schumpeter, the normal capitalism is monopolistic capitalism. And he also believed the monopolistic capitalism is more efficient in terms of production. So even for him, the capitalism that we should keep in mind in the background is not Walrasian capitalism, simply because he also believes that capitalism doesn't exist.
Yeah. Other than this model of, let's say, liberal capitalism and the political capitalism that you've spoken about in the context of not just China, but a few other states that you mentioned, such as Hungary and Turkey and others and Russia, are you seeing other models of capitalism also? Like, would you classify, let's say, India as maybe a different kind, or European nations as a different kind? Or are they all just versions of either of these two forms of capitalism?
I'm not a huge fan of sort of taxonomies. I could have made another taxonomy and then sort of played with different countries left and right. But I think it is sufficient that we should keep in mind that ideal typically, like in Max Weber, we really deal with two capitalism. One where it's liberal because it is liberal in the political arena. That's what the thing is. It is liberal in terms of multi-party democracy. It is also maybe plutocratic because this multi-party democracy really depends on money. But it is liberal in terms of ability to, to speak freely and to participate freely in the political process. On the economic side, it is capitalist. Now, in the case of China and elsewhere, we have, maybe you can call it state capitalism, as Lenin called it. I think it's perfectly fine to call it state capitalism. I chose the term political simply because it comes from Max Weber, and it seems to me it's a little bit maybe better because it shows the very heavy dose of political involvement in the economic sphere, which is just not left out. And the state is autonomous. When I say the state is autonomous, it means that the state can make decisions that are really not determined only by the interest of the capitalists who are actually running the system. And of course, I mentioned several such decisions that China did, and it would be very difficult to do in the US simply because the American system is more strongly politically controlled by rich class or by capitalists. But I agree with you, we cannot I mean, there are many other countries that are in between, and there are also many differences. But as I said, I don't think that we should go into these varieties of capitalism literature to a great extent. Like, if you ask a question, where would you put Indonesia, for example? I would tend to put it in liberal capitalism. I would put India there as well, but again, India is also a little bit different. You know, the role of the state is different. The decentralization in India at the state level is much greater than in more centralized systems, politically centralized systems. So, you know, I would not try to put every country and every, I mean, and countries change every country year in a pigeonhole.
No, which is fair. Which is fair. I think spoken like a good World Bank, ex World Bank person as well. I think that's right. I think different countries have, different combinations of political, social, and economic levers that they ultimately end up using for what works for them at that time, typically. Let's get into this idea of economic inequality that you raise, obviously across various books. But let's start talking about in the context of visions of inequality. As I started to read some of that, um, of course, the first question that arises in my head is, um, how come no Asian economists
Okay.
in that mix?
No, it's a fair question actually. You know, I took there. Okay, my decision is based on two criteria. The first one, the really first is a history, right? So it goes all the last individual profile there as individual is Kuznets 1960. So I looked first at economists who were very influential historically, and I think that this combination of Kenne first, Adam Smith next, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, Wilfredo Pareto, and Simon Kuznets indeed represents a group of very influential economists, and I looked at their work
Yeah.
on income distribution. Now, you say why there are no Asian economists and Indian? The reason is the following. If I were to look at normative part, and as you know, the book is not normative. The book is asking the question, how do you, from each of them, how do you see in your lifetime, what forces do you see determining income distribution, and how do you believe income distribution would change with advancement of capitalism or whatever society that you consider. Uh, and if I were to take a normative view, certainly Amartya Sen would be there. But there will be other people. Rawls would be there. Rousseau would be there. So there would be other economists. There would not be the six that I mentioned. And actually, there are two other books that were written at the same time, obviously by different authors, that actually take that point of view. And they have people other than Smith and Marx. They have very different people. They have Machiavelli. They have Rousseau. They have Rawls. They have Condorcet. They have Amartya Sen, and so on. So that was for the absence of Sen. But then you can say more broadly, why not somebody from the 19th century? I think that simply the fact is the most influential economists were people from the countries that were then at the forefront of economic development. And essentially they defined what economics is for us. And the fact is that, David
Yeah.
Ricardo really studied only a problem which is so proper, so limited to the UK, but of course became the worldwide problem in the sense that it actually influenced the development of economic science. So that was the reason, and you can also say there are no women except mentioned in the, John Robinson is mentioned and Rosa Luxemburg. But there are no single profile, and for the same reason that I already explained.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's obviously, my question was obviously a bit tongue in cheek, but only to actually get to this point that you just made that, that most of the influential economists, and I studied economics in the US as well, and most of the economists you study, with the exception of, as you were saying, when I was in college, I studied Amartya Sen's books, etc., and a few others who were maybe non-US, non-Western European economists, but really very few, right? And I wanted to ask you, as someone who's grown up in Yugoslavia, as someone who spent then, I guess, the bulk of your professional career in the US, to what extent do you think this is a problem for our world? especially in a world now where the rest, right, which is not the West, have become such a bigger part of our world economy.
Well, I don't think it's a problem. I think what is changing is that non-Western economies, whether they are working in the West or working elsewhere, like India or China, are becoming much more important. So, a book like mine, there are two ways I think to actually improve on the book that on wages of inequality. One possibility is to take important economists from the past who are non-Western economists and to look at how they consider the same problem of income inequality. Japan would actually play quite an important role there because they had many Marxist economists who were, I'm talking of more recent whom I know, like Morishima. But, you had also earlier economists. So that could be a possibility. Then, of course, big countries like India or China, although many of them were more social sciences. So that's one possibility. Second possibility is to do the same thing, but now with more recent, last 50 years. There you would have lots of, economists from different countries that would be included there. But if you, I believe, objectively look at the people who influence development of economic science, in and having lived in the 19th century, you really end up with the choice that I made, which you might actually add a little bit there, one or two people. Now, let me just ask one very briefly. The number 7 economist, whom I actually very seriously considered of including, I'll tell you why I didn't include, would have come after Kuznets, and that was Samir Amin. Now, Samir Amin would immediately answer your question, why there are no other, like non-Western. Secondly, I really was very influenced by him, and actually all the 6 that I put there in the book are people who I've been reading for 40 years. I mean, not all of them 40 years, but certainly Mark Smith, 40 years. Samir Amin, I read him in 1975. And I really wanted to include him, and he has a small section because he was the first one among the first ones that changed the nature of the game by saying, look, income distribution in a given country is determined by external forces. In other words, is determined by the setup of the world economic system. And actually, I was going to include him. However, then I started reading his more recent work. I was very influenced by his Accumulation on the World Scale, which was published in 1975. But then I'm sorry to report that, but my impression is that he did not really advance very much. His papers became repetitive. He was no longer empirical, and my book is really looking for empirical part. And eventually I spent a small section on him, but he did not have the full chapter. Maybe it was a mistake. I discussed that. I said maybe I should have included him, but it answers a little bit your question. I had really a dilemma until probably almost the end of the book whether he should have chapter 7 or not.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about inequality as a concept, how you studied it. The first, thing that most people think of, non-economists in the world, when they think of inequality, is the Gini coefficient.
Right.
That's the measure that typically people look to if they're not economists to see whether inequality is getting worse or better. What, according to you, are the right metrics for any country, really, and even lay non-economist people to be thinking about when they are thinking about inequality?
I think even economists think of Gini coefficient first. I think of Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient is a very powerful and it's very intuitive matrix. It is, as you know, it actually takes incomes of everybody, compares them, makes mutual comparisons, then adds all these distances which exist between individuals, divide them by the number of comparisons that we have made, which is n squared, because of course I compare my income with everybody else and everybody else compares then their income, and normalizes it by the mean income of that society. So it sounds like too many things are happening, but eventually what it does, it produces a number which goes from 0 to 1, with a 0 being a theoretical situation that everybody has the same income, and 1 being equally theoretical situation that one person or one household has the entire income of that unit. But the number, does make, I think, sense. People are used to that and so forth. Now, of course, there are other measures. There is tail coefficient, there is Atkinson measure, or you can have measures that would actually focus on one part of the distribution, like the famous top 1% that Piketty brought in, or you can actually take the ratio of the 10%, 20% on the top versus 20% on the bottom, or you have a Palma ratio, which is also similar. But in my opinion, the problems with these other ratios is that they leave all the rest of the distribution unconsidered. For example, if I tell you the share of the top 1% is X, that's fine, but I have no idea what's happening for the other 99%. They can be all bunched together with very small differences in income, or they can be really very much far apart. But I'm not really arguing for one measure. I do use Gini, generally speaking, but you can use other measures. They have very high correlation between them, so it's not really that one measure will give you totally opposite result.
Yeah. So maybe then using the Gini coefficient or any other measures, really, Branko, draw out a landscape for us on how the world is doing on inequality. What are the major trends across various
Yeah.
dimensions, various groups of people? How do you slice and dice this, big behemoth idea of
Yeah.
global inequality? How's the
Let me
world
be
doing on it?
let me be very sort of rough in that sense. Let's look at first, which 99% of people look first, is what is inequality in my country. Okay, so then we have, of course, again this Gini coefficients, and if you look first among rich countries, the OECD countries, and compare today's inequality with inequality at the time of the neoliberal revolution or the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. So we are taking basically today versus 1980, approximately speaking. In practically all rich countries, you have higher inequality now than you used to have then. That's true for the US, true for the UK, true, very interestingly, significantly true for Sweden, true for Italy, true for Spain. There are some countries where the increase is like zero, close to zero: France, Belgium, Austria, Finland, and all of that. And they are generally countries with unusually low income inequality. In Gini terms, below 30. So that's really a few countries, including some of former socialist countries like Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, essentially Central European countries that are small. They are fairly equal. Then you look at the rest of the world. Of course, Africa, very high inequality. India, very high inequality when you look at income. India is really having South American levels of inequality when you look at income. When you look at consumption, which is normally something that India has been producing, consumption service, since 1952, the Gini in India is about 35, which is like moderate inequality. But when you look at income surveys, which have been produced only more recently, the Gini in India is more than 50, which really places India at the same level of many Latin American countries, maybe just below Brazil. So it really depends whether you really...
Where are some of the OECD countries at?
Well, in that case, India is just way above OECD countries in income inequality. So India would be like a Latin American country if you take income. But India has a very large gap between income and consumption inequality. And so that's the issue. Whether consumption inequality at the top is underestimated, that's quite possible. But I do tend to believe, with these most recent income surveys, that India is really a country which has, broadly speaking, Latin American level of inequality, significantly above OECD. The OECD most unequal are Israel and the US with a Gini of 40, and India is 50. So then you come
where does, let's say, China and others?
And then China, we come to China. China has higher inequality than the US, not by much, but higher. So let me then summarize it like that. You have Latin American countries and Asian countries. South Africa is an outlier. They start at a level of extremely high level of 60. Then you have Latin American countries, most of them, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Dominican Republic, then small countries in Central Asia, very unequal, like Nicaragua, Honduras, and so on, at 50, 50 plus. India, I would say at 50. Then you come to China and the US, upper 40s, Russia, about 40. Then you go to the average OECD, mid-30s, and then you come to equal countries, which are essentially small Central European countries, and a few Nordics, which are about 28. So that's the picture of the world, and for most of them, they are more unequal now than they used to be in 40 years. But the range, let me put it the range is from 30 to 60. That's basically where the range is.
And you mentioned that the OECD countries are getting, with some exceptions, more unequal over the last, let's say, 30, 40 years. What about the others? Are they getting more unequal or staying the same? Or how is that movement trend in the other countries?
That's actually quite interesting because Latin America, which is a continent, as we all know, with very high inequality, practically all countries have high inequality, possibly with the exception of Uruguay. Latin American countries have reduced inequality in the last 20 years. So they have started for very high. They are still very high, but it's a little bit less. Now, some people question that. They say, well, if you take the top 1% or even 5% is underrepresented. So even if we do adjustment for that, we do not have an increase in inequality. So Latin America is a very interesting case of a very high inequality continent that has shown a reduction of inequality over these last 40 years. There are debates why it has happened. Some say it's leftist government. Some say actually improvements in terms of trade during one period, which were not then reversed and so on. But I think Brazil, there is little doubt that Brazil has improved its income inequality. But when I say improved, it doesn't mean it's good. It is actually much worse than in any OECD country. So, we should realize that when we say improvement, it simply means it's a delta change. It's a change. But if you really start by being very, very bad and you improve a little bit, that doesn't make you excellent. Yeah.
Excellent. No, of course. What about China? Is levels of inequality in China trending downwards or upwards?
Well, China is a very interesting case, and I spent quite a lot of time with Chinese microdata and also with the data that they publish, which are not as plentiful. And we do have problems both with Indian data and Chinese data now, which are actually more severe than 10 years earlier. But I will leave that aside for a moment. But anyway, China in the last 15 years approximately has remained, according to the official data, at that very high plateau of a Gini above 40, but it has remained at that plateau. So it has really not changed. When you look at rural versus urban, the gap between the two has diminished. In other words, that gap, which was very high, urban areas in China were much richer than rural areas. That gap has diminished, but inequality in both rural and urban areas has gone up. So that's a very complex thing, that rural area inequality goes up, urban area goes up, the gap between the two of them is reduced, and overall inequality stays broadly stable. But we have other things in China. For example, I did recent paper with the two Chinese authors about corruption in China because they published the data. And you actually can see how that corruption of these big guys, what they call the tigers, how that corruption is really concentrated at the top of the income distribution. And given that the amounts of corruption are so large compared to the incomes, the average, the median corruption compared to the legal income that you had is between 5 and 6 times larger than your legal income. So that obviously would push you much higher up in income distribution and would add to the Gini. So the real Gini with that corrupt income is certainly significantly higher than the Gini that we have with legal incomes. So there are many issues there. China is a super interesting country to study. We do have problems with data, but it kind of sometimes improves. Sometimes you have more data, sometimes it gets worse. So it's not a uniform movement towards improvement nor towards deterioration.
Seems like nicely managed. However it is. What about trends in India? Are you seeing along the different dimensions, urban, rural, maybe north, south, different ways in which you might have looked at the data for India? What are some of the key trends you're seeing in terms of changes in India?
India, when you look at the famous NSS, National Sample Survey, which, as I said, exists from 1952, you see is actually not very important, relatively moderate increase in inequality over a period, especially after 1991 and then in the 2000s, where you did have an acceleration of growth in India, and by many sort of anecdotal or rather less anecdotal impressions and data, an increase in inequality. But on that consumption-based survey, you don't see it. I vaguely remember, but for example, the Gini coefficient goes, I'm talking now rural areas, for example, from 32 to 34 to 36. It never reaches even 40. I mentioned the Chinese inequality is about 40, so it seems to be less. Urban areas are more unequal, obviously, than rural areas. But even there, I looked at, I think, most recent data a few days ago, and India's Gini on consumption, again, is under 40. Yeah, it is. You don't see much of a change or much of an increase. So that's why I have sort of recently become somewhat skeptical about consumption data, and I have started using income data, of which unfortunately there were only two surveys. And when you compare them, they do make sense because first of all, some of the rich people have large savings. So, when you look at their consumption may be objectively represented in the surveys, but they have large savings which they invest, and that, of course, are not part of consumption, right, but are part of income. And then, as I mentioned to you, you have a very large Gini of over 50. So I think 51 was the number. So that gap between consumption and income in India is, just to tell you very quickly, is 51 versus, let's suppose, 38 or 37. That gap is then 14 Gini points approximately. That's a very unusual gap. We know that there are always gaps between income and consumption data, but the gaps are about 7 Gini points, not 14. So that seems to me to indicate either an extremely high savings at the top income levels or non-participation of the rich in consumption data. So in other words, consumption data is really based towards the poor and the middle class. And last point, that would not surprise me because the original idea of NSS was to study poverty, especially rural poverty, and to find who are really and where are the really poor people. NSS did not have the objective to find urban rich people. So, I think maybe that the frame itself was done in such a way that this result kind of is not unusual.
Yeah. We've talked about rural, urban, we've talked about different parts of the world. Let's talk about inequality as far as men versus women is concerned, right? What are some of the key trends you're seeing there between men versus women? Of course, I'm sure that historically it's been very, very skewed against women, but are you seeing any changes, any improvements there?
Okay, I will have to disappoint you on that because I really cannot, with the data that I use, you cannot see that. And the reason is follows. The unit at which household surveys take place, what you call the atomic unit, which you don't break any further, is household. So whenever I've talked about this income inequality, it was the household income then divided by the number of people there. So technically, each household has a Gini of 0 because you divide really everybody in that you give the same portion of total income to them, and you don't see then women versus men. Now it's possible to do that, but then you have individual studies that are really hard to do, which go into the consumption pattern of individual members of the household. But this is not done at the global level. These are really very limited studies. This is different from wages. Wages are received by individuals, so you can see inequality of wage earnings between men and women. But when it would come to the total income, that was by construction. And it's not like some bad guys. It's simply the construction is such that the household is considered as a unit which receives the income, and within that unit, perfect equality implicitly holds. Because everybody sort of would go and say, okay, inequality is on the increase because I've just explained that most countries have seen an increase. But then global inequality, which is inequality between individual citizens of the world, is on the decline. So these two things have to be really kept in mind at the same time, which is a little bit difficult. And why is global inequality on the decline? Because the main element of global inequality is what happens to the incomes of poor people in countries that used to be poor. And these countries that used to be poor are China, India, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and so forth. And they have moved up in the income distribution, and they have lots of people. And thereby, global inequality has been reduced significantly by 10 Gini points in the last 25 years. And then we have now an entirely different global income distribution with many more people in the middle. And for the first time in 2 centuries, we see some parts of the Western income distribution declining in their global positions because of the rise of Asia. So the rise of Asia is an absolutely momentous event, which is very similar to the Industrial Revolution. It's now the Industrial Revolution kind of in a reverse, in the sense that people who were relatively poor are now moving up. And it has many other similarities, like deindustrialization of the rich countries, similar to deindustrialization of India during the Industrial Revolution and so forth. But this is important to keep in mind. Inequality between global citizens has been significantly reduced over the last 25 years.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point to add, and of course, in line with another conversation I had with a British author called Hamish McRae, who's written about 2 books. One, The World in 2020, which he wrote about some 30, 40 years ago, and then a book more recently that he's written, The World in 2050. And one of the standouts from that conversation, Branko, for me, a number that stood out for me was that he mentioned that by 2050, and I might be getting the numbers a little bit wrong, but generally I think they're right. By 2050 or so, or maybe 2060, you're saying that we'll be living in a world of about 9.5 billion people.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
But for the first time in history, almost 7 billion of those will be in the middle class. Right? And especially as someone, like you, who's studied sort of pre-industrial societies as well, and inequality back in the Roman Empire, and earlier states, so to say, that we've had prior to the Industrial Revolution, and the nation states that we see today. I wanted to ask you, is that a secular trend that you see? Now, this rise of the middle class, as you mentioned, rise of Asia, are we living in a world of greater and greater convergence now?
It's not a secular trend if you take it of like several centuries. Let's suppose we have the data of some kind from the after Napoleonic Wars. So First industrial revolution. First industrial revolution was characterized first by increasing inequality between the countries and consequently between individuals. China went down in income, India was stagnant, the West went up. So global inequality exploded because of that. Plus, within individual countries, like suppose UK, US, France, inequality within countries increased. So in the period between 1820 and the World War I, you essentially have an increasing global inequality driven by divergence between countries and class divergence within societies. Then you have very high level of inequality plateau, during the sort of the American dominance and the creation of the three worlds. And this is very high inequality, which is slightly being reduced because of compression of incomes in Western countries, thanks to the welfare state and communist revolutions in the Soviet Union and China. But then you have the third period, and that's the current period that I already explained, which really begins big time with China, but then continues with all other countries in Asia. So we do have rise of Asia, and we have now, you can maybe call it secular if it continues, the trend where there will be more and more people, and that's very obvious now, around the middle of the global income distribution. However, this is not the middle class in the Western sense, because these people are much poorer. But if you draw the global income distribution, you have a long normal shape, which normally you have for individual countries. So yes, it is really a revolutionary change, and I agree, if it were to continue like that, although, it's not obvious because Africa has not really converged. But if, for example, Africa were to converge, yes, we would have more and more people in the middle, and it would be a much more compact and a much more convergent world. But as I said, I'm not so sure, especially because of lack of convergence of Africa and because of other things which would happen, as we know now, with war between Russia and Ukraine, a trade war, and possible maybe hot war between US and China. So really, that really doesn't allow you to project things, 50 years from now.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to the geopolitical risks for growth and inequality in a little bit. But just to stick with the point of Africa, one of the other conversations I had recently with Professor Ian Golden at Oxford talked about Africa, and we talked about population trends. And it's also clear that in another 30 to 40 years,
right,
the only continent that will be growing very rapidly in terms of population growth is Africa.
Yeah.
Whereas even countries like India, and of course China is already starting to go below replacement rate. India might start also to do that in the next couple of decades, if not sooner. So now, what does that mean for our global income distribution chart if Africa doesn't converge, but also becomes a much bigger chunk of the world population?
Right. Yeah, the answer is obvious. If Africa doesn't converge, and I'm not a huge optimist on that, and Africa is the only continent with rising population, whereas everywhere else it is either replacement rate or decline, global inequality, the decline in global inequality would come to an end, and we will have an increase. So if I were to chart from the first industrial revolution, we have a significant increase in global inequality. Then a plateauing, then you have to do, then a decline. Now, it could be that we go back to an increase because China is no longer engine of reduction of global inequality since it has become fairly rich. In other words, the median Chinese has a higher income than the median person in the world. India could come within that position in 2 decades, and then Africa will start playing really key role. So that's, there is, I think, no doubt mathematically, a population growth rate cannot be stopped, and African growth rates on per capita basis, which matters here, have been relatively disappointing since 1960 until today. So we really have, the conclusion is very simple. If you want global inequality to continue going down, Africa has to increase its growth rates to a point of 7 to 8% per year. whereas they had 3.
Yeah.
So, will it be done?
Okay.
And if it doesn't happen,
You're not optimistic, I think.
I'm not. And if it doesn't happen, then you would have not only increasing global inequality. After all, people say, okay, well, it doesn't matter. The Gini could be like 65 instead of 50. But it does matter for 2 reasons. First of all, it matters for domestic political stability of those countries. And secondly, it matters hugely for migration. Europe is living in a kind of world of oblivion. Europe and Africa are not only geographically close, they are culturally close. People forget that Europe and Africa had actually 4,000 years of joint history, that Africans speak European languages because of colonization and so on. And if you have a gap in incomes of 10-1, people would come. And then we would do, as you now do in Europe, you actually create a fortress. But the more you create a fortress, the fewer people you have at home, because simply people are not reproducing in Europe, and you need labor force. So I think Europe really should think much more about how both it should help Africa and how it should help people from Africa migrate and get good jobs and be integrated. I think this is a basic problem for the existence of Europe as a sort of successful part of the world in the 21st and 22nd century.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you on that. And a topic I went in quite a lot of detail with Professor Ian Golden also, that the attitudes towards migration in Africa, in Europe, vis-a-vis the rest of the world, non-European, non-white world, will have to change if Europe wants to see economic growth, and of course, given the demographic trends that we expect. The same could possibly be argued for the US as well, and maybe even for countries like Japan, that attitudes towards migration will need to change. But let's you started to touch upon this. Let's talk about geopolitics. That's often a key theme we touch upon on this podcast. How do you expect the current geopolitical events, right, and trends over the last 5, 7, 10 years, let's say, not just the last 2 years, but let's say the last 5, 10 years? What are some of the key geopolitical trends that are, one, impacting inequality, global inequality for you, according to you? And second is, how do you expect the geopolitics to impact global inequality levels going forward?
We already touched, I think, on some of them, which are long-term trends. Let's call it like Brodel, longue durée. And the first one is the relationship between the US and China, and obviously a growth rate of China, ability of China to go into high technologies, and to represent a new pole of development that could be replicated elsewhere. So that trend, I think, is going on. China may be slowing its rate of growth, which I think is not unexpected. They cannot grow by 8% forever. But so long as the gap in growth between the US and China remains, China would be catching up. And I did a nice exercise actually for foreign affairs when I calculated when would the number of quote unquote rich Chinese in numbers be the same as the number of rich Americans. And there is definition of what is wealth, which is actually having income above the median of the US. And that answer is that if Chinese gap in growth, higher growth rate, is about 2% per year higher than the American, then you would actually need only 1 generation. So it's really basically fairly close, 20 to 25 years. If the gap is 3%, then it's actually even shorter. But if there is no gap, obviously there will be no catch-up. So that's the point. But in any way, I think 2% gap in favor of China would make the same number of rich Chinese as the Americans within 30 years approximately. So that's actually quite close. That's one big geopolitical trend. Another one we already mentioned, so I will not say much, is the issue of Africa rates of growth in Africa. Basically, population growth rate is given. You're not going to change that much, so that I think is given for now. Then later, maybe you will change, and it could be that we are actually maybe overestimating the increase of inequality in population, as we did for India and China, in the 1960s. So maybe that actually the increase in Africa will be less. And finally, there are geopolitical trends on which we can say really nothing. Okay, let me tell you, the third one is climate change, which is really also very important because it would tend to really affect, as we know, the most tropical countries that actually tend anyway to have lower level of income. And then the last trends on which can say nothing is what are now really the huge, political and military issues. And these are the two wars that are going on now, plus inability to forecast and to say anything about the further relations between the two largest economies in the world. We forget that US and China represent 40% of the global GDP. So if you have two countries with 40% of the global GDP fighting each other, not only fighting, hopefully, not militarily, but even economically, that slows down not only them, that slows down the rest as well. We never had in the last 60 years, since the end of World War II, 8 years, never had two largest economies contribute so much to the global GDP. So they would soon come to 50% of the global GDP.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. I think even my conversation with Ruchir, he was quite pessimistic about US growth, given the high levels of debt and that the US is sitting on. Michael Pettis, on the other hand, in my conversation with him, was very pessimistic about Chinese growth, given, again, very high levels of debt and structural issues in the Chinese economy, not being able to move from, a largely export-driven economy, high investment economy to a more high consumption economy. And so you're right, if 40 to 50% of the world economy is not just at war with each other, but for various structural reasons are going to slow down significantly, then of course that has massive implications for the rest of the global economy and the ability for other countries to catch up. What's your sense on India? Like, what prospects do you see for India then, if the US possibly slows down, the Chinese slow down, and there's geopolitical battles between these giants?
India is obviously a giant, and India now, I think, actually would come to play geopolitically more and more important role. And let me say why I think so. First, India is not going, I think, to join fully any of the camps. So that would be a player that might actually exert determining influence because it is a large player, continuous growing its economy, is now the largest country in population-wise in the world, and could then play the role where its greater support from the other or one side or the other side proves important or determinant. Because India is the only very important country, plus a nuclear power, which is not really in anybody's camp. It has democratic system. It has strong role of the state. It has conflicts with China. It has fairly good relationship, but always somewhat distant with the United States. So it's not an easily classifiable country, in my opinion. And that fact would actually, in my opinion, increase its importance because everybody would be sort of trying to have India on its side. So I would see India's geopolitical role definitely on the rise, also economically, because of course India has extremely high skilled people and is very good in high tech technologies. So I think it would be an increasing power of India, and that increasing power of India is really a reflection of the increasing power of all of Asia. there is a clear shift of influence towards the Pacific. Then from Singapore had this nice graph that would show where the gravity of the world, economic gravity of the world is, and it is definitely moving towards the Pacific, and the Atlantic is becoming less relevant. By the way, it is almost absolutely unknown, but Marx in one journal article said, in the future, the Atlantic will become the Mediterranean and the Pacific would become the Atlantic. And I think that would be if things go like that in 50 years. And then the Indian Ocean would also become, and is becoming, much more important than it used to be. So anyway, this is a little bit too far probably, but I do think that actually India and Brazil also, which is also a big country, and it's not aligned with any of the blocs. I'm actually a big fan of non-alignment. That's what my former Yugoslav background
You're
would
from
suggest.
Yugoslavia. I think India and Yugoslavia
Absolutely.
were very much, I think,
And
the
now,
leaders of the non-aligned
when I
movement.
see the for the first time South Africa taking a very strong international role, and Brazil as well, and India, and I really think that this part of BRICS, not the Russia-China part of BRICS, because they are really different. I really see that this part of BRICS could potentially become the core of a new non-alignment movement.
And could they also, in your view, change the trend that we are seeing towards, the anti-globalization trends that we are seeing and the industrial policy trends that we are seeing, onshoring, friendshoring trends we are seeing? Do you think that the India, Brazil, South Africa of the world can reverse that, or is that system really too tightly controlled by the US and Western Europe today, that the moment the US says I want industrial policy and China says I'm going to do industrial policy, that's then a given for the Brazils and the Indias and South Africas of the world?
Yeah, I'm afraid a little bit what you said that that's the case, because once the most important countries, and the U.S. is crucial here, not only because it is the largest economy in exchange rate terms. It's not in PPP terms, but anyway, that's the second, or in exchange rate is number one. But it's also ideologically very important, and it has huge influence for international organizations. So once the US starts, as it is now, increasing tariff rates, using economic coercion, creating new trade blocs, and so on, it does create a precedent that others then don't have much choice, but they have to do the same thing. Like if the US creates its own bloc, what is China going to do? China has to create its own bloc. There is a little bit of that. And then ideologically, US has a huge role. It defines economic moment at the time. Countries, however large, like India and China, are not really in the position yet to define that as much. And so in that sense, I think that US would be predominant in making others do similar things that they are doing. Now, it is true, and I agree with that part, and this is a caveat, that large countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa need not be just mere spectators. They can actually organize themselves and try to sort of reverse that unfortunate movement, which I believe, which is a movement against globalization, which is the result, in my opinion, of the fact that one country, namely China, has been doing very well under the American rules. So now, since the rules are no longer good for the US, they say, okay, we now, change the rules. And that's what we are doing now.
Yeah. Yeah, which goes back to the first question I asked you, that when the economic discourse of the world, as might have been reflected, let's say in the six that you picked for your own book, if the economic discourse and the economists that are shaping the discourse of the time are concentrated in one geography, let's say in the US today, even if they might have originated from other countries of the world, then of course you have a discourse that ultimately becomes very, very influential, right?
Absolutely.
So today, if economists out of the US start talking about industrial policy, start talking about how trade needs to be done differently. Unfortunately, that's the discourse that becomes the main discourse yet again.
Yeah, I think
But let me ask you one other
yeah.
question. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I agree. I just was saying
No,
that
go
will
ahead. Go ahead.
become a main discourse. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I want to ask you about technology, right? One of the other pieces that I wanted to ask you about the impact of it on inequality was technology, right? So, of course, most of the time today, if you talk about technology, people are talking about AI now, artificial intelligence as the new possible engine for productivity growth and hence economic growth in the world in the coming decades. What's your view on how tech has been shaping inequality, both within countries and between countries, over the last 20, 30 years that we've seen the rise of, what are now known as the big tech firms? And second, so that's from a last 20, 30 year standpoint. And then also from a future standpoint, how do you expect technology to shape inequality patterns in the world going forward as well?
I will be brief on that because I have not studied that. So I can just draw on what other people have said and on some empirical evidence that I've seen that could be related to technology. Now, we have had, that's a fact, we have had in most, not only in rich countries, but also in India, China, and elsewhere, we have had a rising capital share. The capital share increased over the last 30 years. It thereby negated that kind of fantasy law that the shares between capital and labor would remain constant. And that increase in the capital share had an impact on rising inequality. So functional income distribution changed in favor of capital, personal income distribution became more unequal. The next question is, what will happen with new technologies, especially artificial intelligence? It seems to me reasonable to assume that it would replace labor, very often even highly skilled or medium skilled labor, and it would further increase the capital share. If it does increase capital share further, and we know the capital incomes are concentrated in the hands of the top of the income distribution, we might say that that particular development, technological development, will further favor richer people and quasi-automatically increase income inequality. So that seems to me reasonable to say. Whether it would happen, I don't know, because of course there will be new jobs also created. Things do not happen exactly in such a binary form that I described it, but I do believe that if there is increase in capital share, income inequality has to go up. We have seen that. It's actually an arithmetical proposition, because if capital income is concentrated in the hands of the rich and there is proportion or the rate of return goes up, that's simply the Gini coefficient will have to go up. So that's what seems to me likely scenario.
Yeah, and that's one of the themes of our conversation with Darren Asimoglu, who's at MIT, who you might know as well.
Yes, yeah.
And we were talking about this AI inequality piece, and he said that if the creators of the LLMs today, of the large language models today, the ones who are leading the AI technological development race, continue to be as important as they are, then there's likely to be a very heavy concentration of wealth that'll go along with the concentration of power to them, and they'll largely be the on the richer end of the socioeconomic spectrum.
Yeah.
And so AI is likely to cause, if you are right in the way you were calculating the capital share of that growing income from AI, then AI might cause actually greater divergence globally than convergence.
But,
Right?
let me just say, AI, okay, let's suppose that I'm right in this kind of explanation that I made before. AI would then create great inequality within countries. But whether it would create overall, I'm not so sure, because AI is not only United States. AI is also China. AI is actually in India, Africa. Also, countries, for example, of Eastern Europe are pretty good in new technologies, and African countries are good. So it is not given that even if income inequality within each country is driven up by artificial intelligence, that its impact globally must be also disequalizing. Because as I said, I really believe, and I have to say, my son, for example, works in financial technology, and Africa is really doing quite well in financial technology. So it might use that tool to essentially maybe catch up.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a question I've studied a fair bit, and I addressed in my book as well, Branko. So my own 2 cents on that is it really depends on whether the technology as it develops gets developed in a very concentrated part of the world, which today one can
I
argue is
see.
Silicon Valley and China to a large extent. But then it's the adoption that might be happening in other countries like Africa and Central Eastern Europe and other parts of the world. But if the development of it stays concentrated, then it's very highly likely, if
Yeah.
you look at history or historical trends, that the wealth that is generated from the use of this technology will also ultimately largely flow back to those two areas of the world, which is Silicon Valley and China, possibly, unless the development gets more democratized or let's say more spread out across the world. I think we might actually see more concentration even in the wealth generated from AI, even though adoption might happen in other countries. And hence you might see greater divergence between countries also.
No,
But
I
there's a
see
big
your
if
point. Yeah.
whether
Yeah.
these countries that you're mentioning, whether in adopting these technologies they can also adapt them enough that they can retain a lot of the wealth that they're generating or producing from the use of that technology.
No, I understand your point. Is actually the question is where the technologies are being created, is not so much where they're being used. And if the creation remains, as you were saying, within the
Yeah,
falls, and that's where the most of the value added from the technology would accrue, then of course global inequality could be actually increased.
yeah. And especially if these end up as monopolies of the kind that we were discussing earlier,
Yes, exactly.
right? So if these end up being monopolies, then they will, of course, monopolize all the profits also. And as a result, you might see adoption, but not wealth creation or income
Yes,
generation
yes,
in other countries.
absolutely. Yeah.
Um, Let me ask you from a policy standpoint, Branko. Have you seen countries, and this goes back, I think, to the point you were making about Sami Amin, right, about the causes and drivers of inequality. Have you seen countries being able to consciously reduce inequality really well in the last 10, 20 years of their own making and not, let's say, global structural reasons like one might attribute to, let's say, China's own
I'm,
rise. Have you seen
oh,
countries being able to do this within their own purviews? And if so, what are some examples?
yes, have not studied individual countries and examples that countries were consciously through government policy reduced inequality. In most cases, as we said, actually inequality went up. But Latin American countries seem to me the only ones, particularly Brazil and Mexico, that have used very large, on a large scale, cash grants that were certainly reduced poverty. Some of them were unconditional cash grants that you would get regardless of whether you're sending kids to school or not. Some of them were conditional. And it could be that these are the only cases where we have seen that kind of really single-minded pursuit to reduce inequality. But I may be wrong. There could be a few other countries, but we certainly did not see any new instruments of importance taking place in Western countries, despite a lot of discussion about the need to reduce inequality. There is a disproportion between the amount of discussion about the need to reduce inequality in the last 20 years and very little of which has been done. So that would be my impression, that not much really has been seen in terms of government policies. New things in terms of
Yeah,
government policy.
new instruments being used beyond obviously
Yes.
the welfare state and typical
Yeah.
subsidies that have been now used for a while. No, this has been great, Branko. We end every podcast with two very quick questions, simple questions, which is basically a recommendation of a book or an author, other than, of course, yourself and me, that you would recommend for people interested in the kinds of topics we've discussed today, and a podcast guest as well.
Oh, well, on the first one, I would suggest I. How should I say? Of course, I'm going to suggest the books that I recently read. They may not have been recently written, but I've recently read them, and I review them
Sure.
on my Substack. And I think the two latest ones were a very good book, which is called by Gary Gertels, called "The End of the Rise and Fall of
The
the
rise and
Neoliberalism in America."
we've had him already. We've
Oh,
had
you
him on
had him
the
already.
podcast already.
Good.
Great
Which is, I think,
conversation.
very
Yeah.
good book, very well written, covering the well-known ground, but in a slightly different way. And I enjoyed it very much. The second book is really an old book that was now republished, and actually my editor asked me to reread it and comment, and it was Polanyi's, Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. Now, that book is from the 1944. It is, of course, a seminal book. It talks about commodification, increasing commodification in a time of advanced capitalism, commodification of labor, capital, and money. It's not an easy book to read because I don't think it's very well written, but it's certainly a hugely important, as I said, a seminal book. So I would suggest these two. But people can go to my Substack and find many others, because many of the books that I read, I also review. There is also, let me just maybe mention
What about
one
a
more.
recommendation for a podcast guest?
Well, that's kind of more, maybe Samuel Moyn. Samuel Moyn, I would
Okay.
say. Queen Slobodian, whom I liked very much. Isabella Weber,
Yes.
who has done work on China. Clara Mattei, who did a phenomenal book on austerity policies in Mussolini's Italy and before Mussolini's Italy. And, well, probably you had him already, Adam Tooze, for example,
Yeah, yeah,
who
yeah.
has
He's been
written on,
recommended. We've not had
yes,
him yet, but he's been recommended by at least a
he
couple of
has
people.
written on all the topics, so you
Giving
can
us
just put a random topic. But I would rather actually have him talk more about history, because he's, of course, economic historian. So these would be
yeah.
some people whom I would recommend. There must be Alice Evans, who is now writing a book, a really extremely ambitious book about gender inequality in history. Like, she's covering or trying to cover like 5,000 years. So this is an
That'd be
encyclopedic
fascinating.
book.
Oh, that'd be fascinating. I looked that up, but that hasn't come out yet, you're saying?
No, no, her book. Well, I don't know when it is going to come out. I think it is so enormous that it might take a long time.
It'll take some time. No, but great. Thank you so much, Branko. I know I've taken up a lot of your time. So thank you for being generous with your time. And this has been a fascinating conversation. And so thank you so much for taking the time to be with me here today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It was really a pleasure. Great questions and great conversation. So actually, the time passed very quickly, at least for me.
Yes, it
So
is.
thank